I was thinking about that, and over time, we've had some people that have played on our hockey rink and that have wanted to play on a league with me. So we'll get them out to a league, and it's always fun to see somebody the first time playing on like a real ice and a real league and a real team, because many times they don't really know all the rules, like offsides in hockey. If you ever watch hockey and you haven't understand what offsides is, most people have no clue, because it just seems weird and odd at first because you're not sure exactly what's going on. But over time, they developed rules for the hockey game to help it go smoother and better, to keep fairness and keep competition. Because if you just have basically everyone does what they want to do and have no rules and no referees or no guidance or what to do, even at my rink, when we play our little games, I have certain rules that I make up for people to follow to help us run smoother. A few years ago, we had somebody, and they were just learning how to skate. And anytime they would go around, their stick was always like up in the air like this. And that's just very dangerous when you see a stick flash in front of your face. And so I had to talk with them and make rules. Okay, these are the rules we have. We have rules when we play in our rink. You can only hit a puck so high. You're not supposed to hit it off the ground because it hits your shin or other parts that you don't want to get hit with a puck. We have rules. Everywhere we go in life, there's rules. There are rules on the road, rules of how to do this. Why? Because we need that to help govern us, to help guide us, to help direct us. Well, this morning we are going to look at some of the core foundational rules of really moral society in general, but specifically kind of the founding of the Old Testament law. And then also how it applies to us today in the New Testament times as we take time to look at the 10 Commandments. You know that I normally like to go verse by verse through a passage and expound the passage, but these next 2 weeks we're going to do something slightly different. We're going to take time to look through each of these 10 Commandments, how they were given in the Old Testament, and yet how they should apply to us today in our New Testament age. So why does God give commandments? If you think about it, the core of the commandments is God has created us. And He knows how we will function best in life because He is the one who made us. This last week, I did something for the first time. I used a timing light. Rich lent me a timing light. I've heard of timing lights, but I have no idea what they were, how to use them. Maybe you've heard of it. It has something to do with an engine. Well, you see, I went and did a thing a few weeks ago. I bought myself a wonderful looking plow truck. I thought I'd give you a picture. This is my plow truck, my beast. And I drove it home, parked it in my garage. When I parked it in my garage, I went to start it, and it wouldn't start up. And I couldn't figure out how to get it going. I asked Rich, I knew he was a little bit familiar with some things, and he gave me some thoughts or insight on what to do. Eventually I found out it was a distributor that was bad. Now, I might be too technical for some of you. Basically, the distributor controls the spark and the gas, or this one particularly, in the engine to make it run. Well, I had to replace it. I'd never done it before, and I went and got apart, and after a while figured out how to replace this distributor. And what you do with this timing light is basically it shows every time the number 1 cylinder sparks, the light lights up, and it helps you to make it run very smoothly is what happens. Now, how did I know how to use that? I didn't. But I looked online, watched some YouTube videos, did some reading, and tried to follow the manufacturer's suggestion. Why? Because they created this thing, and they know how this thing technically works and puts it all together. I knew nothing about it until 2 weeks ago. I started doing some research and figured out, oh, they designed it, they created, they made this. If I follow their rules, I can get it up and running, and I have this truck running. It's really kind of fun to plow. It's a lot more enjoyable than running my four-wheeler. I am plowing because it's warmer in the truck, and also it plows a bigger spot. So I really enjoy that. So hopefully I can keep this wonderful-looking truck running. My wife actually likes the look of the truck. Yeah, it's cool. Now here's why. It's because her grandpa had a truck like that, except different colors, but that's the same colors her first car was that her grandpa bought her. So it reminds her of her grandpa. So she really likes it. Anyways, so the idea here is that we need to know how things work, how things operate, and what better way is to follow the rules that God has given us, because He's the one who designed us. He's the one that created us. Now you might be saying, well, wait a second. Didn't we just finish talking through Galatians, where it says we're no longer under the law? We don't have to follow the law, so why take time to study the law? Well, you're going to find out if you're going to be reading along or following along in the devotional book this week. You get kind of bogged down in some of the Old Testament laws, because it's not just the Ten Commandments. There's a lot more given. God had a plan and a reason for all of these, so why are we going to study them in this New Testament age? It is because God has repeated almost every single Ten Commandment in the New Testament for us to follow. He's given these commands for our good. 1 John chapter 5 says this: everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God. And everyone who loves the Father loves whoever has been born of Him. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey His commandments. So it says we know that we love God when we obey His commandments, for this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments. And His commandments are not burdensome to us. God says, here's how you know you love me, if you keep my commandments. But understand this, God doesn't just give us commands because He's got some power thing and He wants us just to do what He says. He does it because He loves us. In January, Jen and I are going to be teaching a parenting class to any of the parents who want to join and be a part of it. And one of the lessons we will be going over is the importance of teaching first-time obedience to our children. Now, some people say, well, that's just so strict, having them obey the first time. We should be able to give them a bunch of warnings. I don't think so. I think first-time obedience is very good. Let me give you a practical illustration. When my wife and I started teaching this to our children when they were very young, and our oldest daughter when she was about 3, we had taught her the big importance of when we say something, you need to obey, and you need to obey it right away. We were at Menards doing some shopping, and we were going outside the Menards door, and all of a sudden, my girl who was 3 takes off running ahead of us toward the parking lot. And we immediately said, stop, and she stops. Now, we don't say stop because, we don't want her to have any fun in the parking lot. No. About a second later, not even that, a car zooms by in the parking lot. And we were just like, oh. Now, maybe she would have stopped if we hadn't been teaching her this, but imagine if she's just used to when we say stop, she runs along and keeps going on her own. What happens? Easily, she could have got hit. So we're teaching her this and understand the importance of obeying, not because we don't like her or not have any fun, but we know what was best for her and to learn to understand this obedience. God gives us these commands. He says, look, I want you to obey and understand that it should not be burdensome to you. Not be like, oh, God has all these rules that I have to follow. No, when we truly understand God's love, why He's given us these things, it's not the Old Testament rules and regulations, these New Testament principles that help guide and direct our life. But yet many of these were first found here in the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament. And we want to walk through these here this morning. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. He begins by declaring, look, this is who I am. I am the God who delivered you miraculously from Egypt. So I want you to catch, Fred. I want you to listen to what I have to say. So the first command, we should place God above all. Verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. Now in the New Testament, there are many verses that talk about this. Jesus himself used this command. When Satan came to him for the temptations, he had 3 temptations, and this third temptation found in Matthew chapter 4. Again, the devil took him on a high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all their glory. And he said to him, all these I will give you, if you fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, be gone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only you shall serve. So Jesus not only repeats this command, but Jesus uses this command to fight off the attacks of the enemy. Paul emphasized the fact that there is only one true God, and that should be the God that we have above all. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 says this, therefore, as to eating or of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no real God but one. For although there are so many so-called gods in heaven and earth, indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and from whom all things consist, one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things, through our all things and all things whom exist, or we exist. Here he says, look, there is one God. There is one true God. We're reminded you should have no other gods before me. So how does this apply to us today? How can we have other gods or things in front of us that are above God? Let's look at it a practical thing. USA Today. Let's think of the gods of this world, and I think this kind of gives us an example. Politics, sports, entertainment, life, money, travel. Those are all things that can become gods and become more important to God. Doesn't mean we can't do those things. No. All these things probably all of us do in one area or one time or another in our life. We do these things. But when these things become more important to us, they can become a God in our lives. Now, I can't tell you in your life if you've made one of these things a God, because we're all different, but yet in your heart, you can know, and God, the Holy Spirit will reveal to you if these things have become more important in your life than Him. One way to know is when you make choices and decisions. What takes priority? What God desires of you, or what you desire to do? And God gives us that first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. Following me should be the number one thing you desire in your life. The second commandment, very similar to it, is we should not make or bow down to any idol. Verse 4 of Exodus 20. You shall not make for yourself any carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down and serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations to those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands who love me and keep my commandments. Very much just like the first, no other gods before me. This is the idea of an earthly object, something on earth we use even to worship God. There were examples in the Old Testament of this, objects that were good things that at one time became something that they would worship. You see this many times in religions where people worship a building. They worship something that they see. People will hold a cross and carry a cross around with them and tend to worship this object rather than the person. In our society, we tend to worship nature. We worship individuals. There's so many different things that can become an idol, an actual object that we have. John clearly, plainly declared this command. 1 John chapter 5, verse 21 says, "Little children, keep yourself from idols." Now, we're all different, and we all have different things that appeal to us. But it's the idea of God should be first, and really God cannot be contained in any object. Because God himself is everywhere, and the Bible says we need to worship him in spirit and in truth, rather than the objects. These could be even things like the way we worship, our science, or even ourself. These objects that can become idols. And evidence of a belief in Jesus was turning from idols. 1 Thessalonians 1, verse 9. "For they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols, to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come." He said this is what happens when you become a believer. You want to turn from these idols. Now understand, when this Old Testament was written, many times people actually worship physical idols. Now that does exist highly in other countries today. There's many other countries where idols have a little bit stronger presence, but we see that even today. Certain good luck charms. Certain things that are going to ward away evil spirits. We hang on to these things rather than truly trusting God himself. So how do you know if something's become an idol to you? Often it's because when you become possessive of it, it becomes your idol. You're focused because you're possessing this item. Could be a vehicle. A car that becomes so much more important because you become so obsessed with it and possessive of this thing. There's so many different things, these objects that we have, that we tend to find ourselves enthralled with over God. The third command: we should not take the name of God in vain. Verse 7. "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." What does that mean? As a kid, my only definition was this, is I can't use God in a swear word. So we can say gosh, or we can say all these other things that are close, but we just can't say God in a swear word, and that's taking the name of God in vain. Well, it goes much deeper than that. The idea of vain here, the term for it means to lift up, to bear, to carry, to support, to sustain, to endure. So it's the idea of lifting up God's name in a way that is worthless. So how can we do that? I think we have to understand the importance of names, especially in the Bible. When the Israelites traveled a place, we see this, they named that place. Names were very important because they were associated with that individual. So when he talks about naming in vain, is when you think of a name, you associate it with something. When Jennifer and I were having children, one of the hardest things to do for us was to pick out names for our kids. We would spend hours, it seems, as we would take drives, throwing out names that we think we might like, and then we'd always start goofing around and come up with some weird names that we'd never come to a solution. In fact, when one of our kids were born, I think it was when Allie was born, that they asked, well, what are you going to name her? We don't know. Can you give us some time? Because we really haven't decided. We couldn't figure out some of these things. Now, my idea was to name her Allie Catherine, so we could nickname her Alley Cat. Brooklyn Bridget for Brooklyn Bridge was kind of the idea, but Jen didn't like those ideas, so we didn't We didn't go with those. So we would talk and names would come up. For instance, the name John. We talked about that, but I had a friend named John, and one thing he hated most is when we go to the bathroom, we'd say, oh, I need to go use the John. And my friend just hated that. By the way, do you know why they call it the John? No. Interesting fact that you learned this morning. If you don't learn anything else, you can learn this fact right here. That first flushing toilet was invented by Sir John Harrington in the late 1500s.
Thank you, John.
And so therefore it is called the John. I have to go to the John. But we decided not to name our kids John for that. Now I know some of you have named your kid John, so wonderful. I did like the name actually, but we talk about these things as our names, and also we think, oh, I like that name. My wife would say, oh, that's a wonderful name. And I think I know a person with that name, and I do not like that person at all. And so we're not going to name him that. And so it's very difficult. But he says here not to take the name of the Lord and God in vain. There's something powerful about names that to understand that we're associated, whatever's associated with that name. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 12 says, you shall not swear by my name falsely and profane the name of the Lord your God, for I am the Lord. So part of taking the name in vain is basically saying, I swear by God that this is the case, and yet we're doing it falsely. Anything that we use the name of God for should exalt who God is. Now think about this. What do we often call ourselves in the New Testament age? They were first called this in Antioch, Christians. And yet what you have now today is Christian. The name Christian is actually many times a negative view, because often the way Christians act, instead of acting like Christ, they use that to carry out their own desires or their own plan. Jesus in the New Testament expressed honor for the name of God. He says, pray then like this, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Holy is your name. I want you to be exalted because of and through your name. Many other references to the name of God. At the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. Throughout the New Testament, the name was important. And believers can hurt the name of God by their actions. 1 Timothy 6, verse 1 says, let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Here he basically says to the bondservants or employees, do what your employer says to do so that exalts the name of God. They know you're a God follower. They know you're a Christ follower, so that should be exalted by the way that you work. So by taking the name of God in vain, when we declare that we are followers of Christ, that we believe in the God of creation, the God of the world, and yet we live however we want to live, we are taking in vain and making it worthless. We see also through hypocrisy, we can blaspheme the name of God. Romans chapter 2, verse 21 says, you then who teach others, you do not teach yourself. While you preach against stealing, do you not steal? Or do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob the temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. Now Paul specifically here is speaking to the Jews, but the same principle applies. If we say one thing as followers of God but live another way, what are we doing? It says we're blaspheming the name of God. We're taking the name of God. We're using it in vain, because as children of God, our life should be different than the world around us. So by taking the name of God in vain, it's much more than using it as a swear word, as an empty word. But it's the idea of declaring that we are children of God, followers of God, but yet living a completely different way. The fourth one, really interesting command to look at, is to remember the Sabbath day. God establishes this understanding of a pattern of rest. Look at verse 8. He says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day, the Sabbath, is the Lord for your Lord, or your sons or your daughters, or your male servant or female servant, or your livestock or sojourners who is within your gates. For 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that's in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So the command here given in the Old Testament is for them to do no work on the Sabbath, which was their Saturday. By the way, if you go over to Israel today, their Sabbath begins at 6 o'clock Friday night. Starting Friday afternoon, things start to close down. 6 o'clock at night and Friday night, everything shuts down. From 6 o'clock, very few restaurants are open. The only ones that are open are completely non-Jewish people. Very few places to go out to eat. No public transportation. Until about 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock on Saturday night, everything starts open again. Most people actually go out to eat on Saturday night at 8 o'clock because that's considering starting Sunday, is what it is. They're the calendar, the way they do things. More really the biblical understanding is the day began at 6 o'clock the night before. Totally different than what we think in our mindset. So they still honor that Sabbath day. Now, do we have to do this in the New Testament? Well, let's talk about this a little bit. There are people that have heard say, well, Sunday is the Christian Sabbath, so Sunday should be a day where we do a pattern of rest. Genesis 2, verse 2. On the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Now, he doesn't give a command in the New Testament to do this. We'll see this in a minute. But God sets the example by taking a day of rest. So we are not commanded, but given the example, the importance we need as humans to rest. So that's what God had for Israel, specifically the 6th day of the week, the 7th day of the week, their Saturday, was their day of rest. But the New Testament tells us we don't have to keep the Sabbath. Let's look at this, Colossians chapter 2. He says, therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food or drink, or with regard to festival or new moon or Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to God. This is in the context of religious leaders trying to force religious rules on everybody rather than understanding what God truly says. So he says here, no one can force you to say, okay, well, Sunday is the new Sabbath, so you can't do any work. Well, I'd be out of it because Sunday's often my busiest day of the week. In the summertime especially, not only did I get up, prepare go over my message and preach and do the stuff I do here on Sunday. In the summertime, my wife and I then go home and we clean for 2 or 3 hours on Sunday. And it's probably 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock by the time we get done doing that. So Sunday's not really a day of rest for me. On the other hand, Jen and I try to take 1 day a week where we take and don't really even do much work around the house. We take a day to spend together, take a day of rest. I think that's a biblical example, but it's not a biblical command. So we don't have to follow this day of Sabbath, but yet we see the example of it. Paul also addresses this in Romans chapter 14. He says, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor to the Lord. The one who eats in honor to the Lord, since he gives thanks to God. While the one who abstains in honor to the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us die to himself. For if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Again, it's that principle of there's no set rule for you that you have to follow that I can come up with. And God has no set rule for me about this in the New Testament. So it's one of the commands in the Ten Commandments that we don't have to follow. At the same time, it's a command that it gives us an idea of what God desired as a day of rest. Have a day of rest. God also set aside that day to be a time for worship. We do see this repeated in the New Testament. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 says, let's consider how to stir one another up to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. God says, I want you to take time to set time apart to worship. Now, the New Testament, there's a few references in the New Testament church. They met on the first day of the week. They gathered together, which we keep that today on the Sunday. We do. Those in Israel, they meet together on Saturday, and they worship on Saturday. There's not a specific day. But the idea is there should be a time specifically set aside for worship and a time set aside for rest, example to us in the Bible. So these first four commands have to do with what's called a vertical relationship. It's between us and God. Now we're going to look next week at the other 6 commands, and that has to do with how we treat other people around us. So those are our horizontal relationships with people around us, where a vertical relationship is us and God. Very important. We see this pattern often in the Bible, that God establishes the reason we do something and then tells us how to do it. Because if all we do is focus on the how and don't understand the reason behind it, what happens is then the work becomes so important. The keeping of the command becomes so important rather than understanding why are we doing this. In conclusion, I want you to ask yourself these questions. First, are you placing God above everything else in your life? I can't answer that question for you. What does that practically look like? Sometimes it's so hard for me to understand. But it comes to me and God, is there something there that I'm placing more important than you? Now, our lives are going to go through ups and downs, where sometimes we have lots of time, and other times we're just stretched for time. But in all that we do, is God the priority? You have to ask God that for yourself and let Him reveal it to you. Secondly, are you letting physical things pull you away from God? It draws your attention away from what God has for you. Third, do you revere the name of God? Is the name of God special? And again, it's not to the point of it just focused on the name. The importance behind the name wasn't the name only in and of itself, but what it represented. Are you a representative of the name of Christ? When others see you and know you're a Christian, do they understand that you are truly a follower of Christ, or is it just in name? Lastly, is setting aside time for rest and worship a priority in your life? Now, we rest in different ways. We worship at times in different ways, but it needs to be a priority in our life that God has established these patterns for us. I want everyone to bow your heads, close your eyes, just take a moment to let God speak to your heart.